Part 1: Childhood, Family, and the First Crack. The summer I turned 8. My father built a treehouse that was never finished. Not because he ran out of wood. Not because he forgot. But because life interrupted him in a way none of us understood at the time. Even now, when I smell fresh pine or hear the rhythmic knock of a hammer against old wood, I don't think about construction. I think about promises. And about how some promises stay unfinished for years before anyone realizes they were never broken at all. People often say childhood disappears. Mine never did. It simply stayed frozen inside a small blue house at the end of Willow Creek Road. The paint peeled a little more every spring. The porch leaned slightly to the left. The mailbox always squeaked when someone opened it. To strangers, it looked like an ordinary house. To me, it was the center of the universe. My name is Ethan Carter. When I was a child, I believed my parents knew everything. That adults never got scared. That fathers couldn't cry. That mothers never lied. I was wrong about all of it. But I wouldn't learn that for many years. Every morning began the same way. Mom woke before sunrise. The smell of coffee drifted through the hallway before anyone else opened their eyes. She hummed while cooking breakfast. Never loudly. Always softly. The same melodies every morning. Sometimes old country songs. Sometimes church hymns. Sometimes songs with no words at all. Just little sounds that somehow made the whole house feel safe. My younger sister Lily hated mornings. She buried herself under blankets until Mom gently pulled them away. "I'm invisible." "No," Mom laughed. "You're late." Lily groaned dramatically. I liked invisible better. Dad usually walked into the kitchen already wearing dusty work boots. He owned a small carpentry business. His hands always smelled like cedar. There were tiny cuts across his knuckles that never completely healed. He wasn't the kind of father who talked endlessly. He believed love was something you built. A repaired chair, a fixed bicycle, a bookshelf, a swing, a roof that never leaked. Those were his love letters. Even if none of us recognized them back then. Sunday dinners were sacred. No phones. No television. No excuses. Grandpa Henry arrived exactly 15 minutes early every single week. Grandma Eleanor brought homemade apple pie whether anyone asked for it or not. She claimed dessert was impossible to measure. "If one pie disappears," she'd say, "that simply means I guessed correctly." Everyone laughed. Every single Sunday, even though we'd heard the joke hundreds of times. Family traditions don't survive because they're original. They survive because they remind people they belong somewhere. Grandpa had a habit of telling stories no one could prove. He insisted he'd once outrun a bear. Dad rolled his eyes every time. "You tripped over your own fishing pole." "I strategically fell." "You screamed." "I alerted the wildlife." "You cried." My eyes watered. Mom nearly dropped the mashed potatoes laughing. Lily laughed so hard milk came out of her nose. Even Grandpa couldn't keep a straight face. Those dinners felt endless. Looking back, they lasted only a few years. One rainy afternoon Dad came home carrying several long wooden boards. "I'm building something." "What is it?" I asked. "You'll see." That answer drove me crazy. Every afternoon after school I watched him measure. Cut, sand, nail. He never hurried. "It's not about finishing," he once told me. "It's about building it right." At the time I thought he was talking about wood. Years later I realized he meant people. After nearly 2 weeks the shape appeared. A treehouse, hidden high inside the old oak behind our house. It had windows, a rope ladder, even a tiny porch. Dad let me hammer 3 crooked nails into one board. I thought I'd helped build the whole thing. Children measure love differently. Sometimes one nail feels bigger than 1,000 sacrifices. The final roof still wasn't finished when Dad stopped working on it. First, nobody noticed. He simply came home later. He looked more tired. Dinner became quieter. Mom smiled, but only with her mouth, not with her eyes. Sometimes late at night I heard voices downstairs. Not yelling, whispering. Whispers are scarier than shouting. Children imagine the worst inside silence. One evening I walked downstairs for water. The kitchen light was still on. Dad sat alone. A pile of unopened envelopes rested beside him. His elbows leaned against the table. His head rested in his hands. I'd never seen him sit like that before. He looked small, as if the room had somehow become too heavy. He quickly straightened when he saw me. Couldn't sleep. I was thirsty. He smiled. It wasn't fake. But it wasn't real either. Adults become experts at smiling halfway. He poured me a glass of water. We stood together without speaking. Finally I asked, "When are we finishing the treehouse?" His eyes drifted toward the backyard. Then back to me. "Soon." He hesitated. "I promise." Children believe promises are dates. Adults know their hopes. The next week Dad began leaving before sunrise, returning after dark. Mom quietly sold her wedding necklace. She told us she had simply stopped wearing jewelry. I believed her. Lily believed her too. Grandma didn't. Neither did Grandpa. But nobody said anything. Some acts of love happen silently. So do some sacrifices. Autumn arrived early that year. Leaves covered the unfinished roof of the treehouse. Rain slowly stained the unfinished wood darker. I climbed inside alone one afternoon. The floor smelled like fresh pine. One corner remained open to the sky. I imagined what it would look like finished. I waited. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. Sometimes unfinished places become symbols long before we understand why. Then came my 9th birthday. Dad had never missed a birthday. Not one. Mom kept glancing through the window. The cake waited untouched. Grandpa checked his watch. Again. And again. Lily whispered, "Maybe he's buying a bigger present." Mom forced a smile. "I'm sure he'll be here." But even as she said it, her hands trembled. Finally headlights appeared outside. Dad rushed through the door, covered in sawdust, completely exhausted. "I'm sorry." He hugged me harder than usual. "So sorry." I smiled anyway, because children forgive faster than adults. But while blowing out the candles, I made only one wish: finish the treehouse. I didn't know that life was already preparing something much bigger than an unfinished roof. And before that year ended, our family would discover a secret that would change every single one of us forever. Part 2: Growing Up and Family Conflicts. The secret didn't arrive all at once. It slipped quietly into our lives, disguised as ordinary days. Looking back, I don't think families fall apart because of one terrible moment. They fall apart because hundreds of tiny moments slowly stop fitting together. One missed dinner, one unanswered question, one tired smile, one promise delayed until tomorrow. And eventually, tomorrow becomes years. By the time I turned 11, the unfinished treehouse had become part of the landscape. The rope ladder had weathered into a dull gray. Birds nested beneath the unfinished roof. Vines climbed one side of the oak as if nature had decided to finish what my father never could. Sometimes I climbed up there after school with a notebook. Not because I liked writing, because it was the only place where the house looked peaceful. From above, I couldn't hear whispered arguments through thin walls. I couldn't see unpaid bills spread across the kitchen table. Everything looked smaller from the tree, problems included. School had become its own world. Some kids measured each other by sneakers, others by the size of their lunch. I measured people by how they treated the quiet kids. That probably came from my mother. She had a way of noticing people everyone else overlooked. The elderly cashier at the grocery store, the lonely neighbor whose wife had died, the stray dog wandering through town. "Everyone carries something invisible," she often said. "So be careful what you add to it." At 11, I nodded without really understanding. Years later, those words would become the compass of my life. My best friend was Noah. We met because we both hated dodgeball. He wore glasses too big for his face and laughed at jokes before anyone else understood them. He dreamed of becoming an engineer. I wanted to become an architect. We spent entire afternoons drawing impossible houses. Tree houses with elevators, glass ceilings, secret libraries, hidden rooms. When we designed them, It felt like we were building futures instead of escaping presents. Lily was changing too. She had always been fearless. Now she was becoming funny. Not the loud kind of funny. The kind that appeared exactly when someone needed it most. When Mom accidentally burned dinner one night, Lily pushed her plate aside. "I've always wondered what charcoal tastes like." Dad laughed. Mom laughed harder. Even the smoke alarm seemed embarrassed. For 5 whole minutes, everything felt normal again. Families survive because of moments like that. Tiny bridges built across enormous cracks. Dad's business, however, continued shrinking. The recession had hit our little town harder than anyone expected. Construction projects disappeared. Customers delayed repairs. People stopped building new homes and started patching old ones themselves. Every evening another envelope appeared on the kitchen table. Every morning another disappeared into Dad's work bag. I never asked what they were. Children instinctively avoid questions they fear adults cannot answer. Then Grandpa Henry suffered a heart attack. It happened while he was fixing the fence behind his farmhouse. Grandma found him lying in the grass beside the toolbox. He survived. Barely. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and quiet fear. Machines beeped steadily beside his bed. Grandpa looked impossibly small beneath the white blankets. For the first time in my life, I realized old people weren't simply old. They were fragile. Dad stood silently beside the bed. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Grandpa smiled weakly. "You still owe Ethan that roof." Dad looked down. "I know. You always finish what you start." Another silence. Then Grandpa quietly added, "Don't let work convince you otherwise." I watched my father's face change. Not dramatically. Just enough to know those words had landed somewhere deep inside him. After Grandpa returned home, Sunday dinners stopped for a while. Hospital visits replaced family traditions. Grandma grew tired. Mom drove over every Tuesday to help with groceries and laundry. Dad repaired anything broken around their house without charging a cent. Even when we barely had enough money ourselves. I once asked him why. He tightened another screw before answering. "Because one day someone will need to help us." "Do they have to?" He smiled sadly. "No." "Then why would they?" He looked toward Grandpa's porch. "Because kindness travels farther than money." That autumn something unexpected happened. Dad started working weekends for a large construction company in the city. The paycheck was better. The hours were brutal. He left before sunrise on Saturdays. Returned long after Lily had gone to sleep. Sometimes after I had too. His boots remained by the front door like proof he still lived with us. But often, it felt as though they were the only part of him that came home. Mom tried to protect us from noticing. She organized movie nights, board games, hot chocolate competitions. Who could build the tallest pancake? She laughed louder than before, cooked our favorite meals, decorated the house for every tiny holiday imaginable. At 12 years old, I finally understood why. She wasn't celebrating. She was distracting us. Parents often mistake protection for silence. Children often mistake silence for safety. Neither is completely true. One snowy evening the electricity went out. The entire neighborhood disappeared into darkness. Dad was still at work. Mom lit candles across the kitchen. Lily declared we were living in the 19th century. Grandma arrived carrying blankets. Grandpa shuffled in behind her with an old kerosene lantern. For hours we sat around the dining table telling stories. No television. No phones. Only shadows dancing across familiar faces. Grandpa told us how he had proposed to Grandma with a borrowed ring because he couldn't afford one. Grandma rolled her eyes. He forgot to mention he dropped it in the river 10 minutes later. Everyone laughed. Even Dad. When he quietly walked through the front door nearly an hour later. He stood there watching us before anyone noticed him. He looked surprised, as if he had forgotten what happiness sounded like. Mom stood, walked over, wrapped her arms around him. No words, just a long embrace. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. That night reminded me of something I'd eventually spend years trying to remember. Sometimes families don't need perfect circumstances. They just need everyone in the same room. Middle school, however, wasn't nearly as forgiving. Kids had discovered cruelty. Not dramatic cruelty. Casual cruelty. The kind disguised as jokes. One afternoon someone noticed my backpack had been sewn twice along one side. My dad says poor people always fix things because they can't afford new ones. The others laughed. I forced a smile. At lunch Noah sat beside me. They're idiots. I know. It still hurts though. I nodded. He understood without needing an explanation. Real friendship often sounds like very little. When I got home that afternoon, Dad was repairing the washing machine. Again. I watched him silently for several minutes. Finally I asked, "Why don't we just buy a new one?" He looked at the machine. Then at me. "Because this one still works. It keeps breaking. So do people." He wiped grease from his hands. "We don't throw them away either." At 13, I thought it was just another one of his strange sayings. Later, I realized he had been talking about much more than appliances. The biggest change came during the spring. Mom started working evenings at the local library. She loved books. Always had. She said it barely felt like work. But I knew the truth. She wasn't chasing a dream. She was chasing another paycheck. Dinner shifted later. Dad arrived even later. Some nights Lily and I ate alone. Our conversations became shorter. The house became quieter. Not peaceful. Empty. One Saturday I climbed into the attic searching for an old baseball glove. Instead, I found a dusty cardboard box. Across the top, written in Dad's handwriting, were 4 simple words. Do not throw away. Curiosity defeated common sense. Inside were photographs, old receipts, a faded wedding invitation, birthday cards, hospital bracelets, then a stack of sealed envelopes. Every single one addressed to my mother. None had stamps. None had been mailed. Each was dated years apart. The oldest was from before I was born. The newest was only 6 months old. I stared at them. My heart raced. Why would someone write letters and never give them to the person they loved? Footsteps echoed below. I quickly closed the box, slid it back beneath the insulation. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night I barely slept. The letters haunted me. What could they possibly contain? An apology? A confession? A goodbye? Or something much worse? I had no idea that opening that box would eventually uncover the truth that had been quietly shaping our family for years. And once those letters were finally read, none of us would ever see my father the same way again. Part 3, the breaking point. I told myself I wouldn't go back into the attic. For nearly 3 weeks, I kept that promise. I focused on school, helped Lily with her math homework, mowed the lawn on Saturdays, and tried to pretend the dusty box didn't exist. But curiosity has a strange way of growing louder in silence. Especially when you're 14. Especially when the people you trust most begin acting like strangers. Dad was home even less now. The construction company had promoted him to site supervisor. Everyone congratulated him. Neighbors said we were finally catching a break. But promotions have hidden prices. His paycheck grew. So did the distance between him and the rest of us. He missed Lily's school concert. He missed my first basketball game. He missed Grandma Eleanor's 70th birthday. Every absence had a reasonable explanation. Every explanation felt true. None of them felt enough. Mom never complained in front of us. Instead, she developed small habits that worried me. She would stand at the kitchen window after washing dishes, staring into the backyard for several minutes without moving. She reread the same page of a novel 3 or 4 times before turning it. Sometimes she smiled at nothing. Sometimes she looked as though she were trying not to cry. One evening I asked quietly, "Are you okay?" She blinked, almost surprised to hear my voice. "Of course." Then she reached over and brushed my hair aside like she used to when I was little. "You've grown so much." She didn't answer my question. At the time, I didn't realize adults often respond to fear by changing the subject. Lily noticed things too. She just expressed them differently. One night, while brushing her teeth, she asked me, Do you think Dad still likes living here? I frowned. What do you mean? He smiles more when he's leaving than when he's coming home. Children often see truths adults spend years denying. I had no answer. The attic called to me again. One rainy Saturday, while Mom worked at the library and Dad was in the city, I climbed the narrow wooden stairs. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight. The box was exactly where I'd left it. This time I opened it slowly. My hands trembled before I even touched the first envelope. Across the front it read, "For Sarah, if I ever find the courage." I knew I shouldn't read it. I also knew I was going to. The letter began simply, "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I've finally stopped being afraid." I frowned. Afraid of what? I kept reading. He wrote about work, about exhaustion, about feeling like he was failing everyone. Then came a sentence that made my heart pound. "I don't think I've told you how scared I am since the day the doctor called." Doctor? What doctor? The next page explained everything. 3 years earlier, Dad had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition. It wasn't immediately fatal, but it carried risks. Heavy physical labor made those risks worse. Stress made them worse. Ignoring treatment made them worse. He had ignored all three, not because he wanted to, because surgery was expensive, and we couldn't afford for him to stop working. I stopped breathing for several seconds. Another letter, written a year later. "Sarah, today Ethan asked when we'll finish the treehouse." I lied again, not because I don't want to, because every time I climb that ladder, I wonder if my heart will hold. I can't let him watch me collapse halfway through building his dream. Tears blurred the page. The unfinished treehouse. It had never been about money, or time, or forgotten promises. It had been fear. I opened another, then another. Each letter revealed pieces of the man I thought I knew. He wrote about pretending to be strong, about lying because he believed protecting us mattered more than telling the truth, about waking up every night convinced he wouldn't live long enough to watch Lily graduate, about secretly increasing his life insurance policy, about asking the bank to postpone payments without telling Mom. One sentence shattered me. "If they remember me, I hope they remember the man who kept trying, not the one who kept disappearing." Covered my mouth. For years I'd been angry. Now, I didn't know what to feel. The attic stairs creaked. I nearly dropped the letters. Mom stood in the doorway. She looked from me, to the open box, to the pages in my hands. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly climbed the last few steps. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, very tired. "I wondered when you'd find them." "You knew." She nodded. "I found the first one years ago. Why didn't you tell us?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because he begged me not to." I stared at her. "You knew he was sick?" "I knew everything." The words hit harder than I expected. "Everything? You both lied to us?" Her voice cracked. "We were trying to protect you." "No." I stepped backward. "You were protecting yourselves." That night was the loudest our house had ever been. Not because anyone screamed, because, for the first time in years, everyone finally stopped whispering. Dad came home just after 9. His smile disappeared the moment he saw us sitting around the kitchen table. The letters lay neatly stacked between us. He didn't ask where we'd found them. He already knew. He slowly removed his jacket, pulled out a chair, sat down. No one spoke. Finally he whispered, "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Not anymore." I looked at him across the table. "How long?" "Almost 4 years. You let us believe you didn't care. I thought it was easier." "For who?" Silence. Mom reached for his hand. He didn't move. "I didn't want you growing up afraid." Dad's voice was barely audible. "I wanted you to remember normal." I laughed bitterly. "Normal? You missed everything." "I know. You lied." "I know. You let me hate you." His eyes finally met mine. "I know." There was no defense. No excuses. Only regret. Sometimes the truth hurts more because no one is trying to deny it. Lily burst into tears. She ran upstairs. Mom followed. Dad remained seated, his shoulders slumped. He suddenly looked 20 years older. I had imagined this conversation countless times. I thought learning the truth would make me feel relief. Instead, I felt robbed. Not of time, of honesty. For days the house barely functioned. Breakfast happened in silence. Dinner happened separately. Dad slept on the couch. Mom cried when she thought no one could hear. Lily stopped making jokes. Even Grandpa and Grandma sensed something had changed. Grandpa visited one afternoon carrying a toolbox. Without saying a word, he walked into the backyard. He climbed into the unfinished treehouse. Slowly, carefully, he began measuring the roof. Dad watched from the porch. For nearly 10 minutes. Then he stood, walked across the yard, picked up another hammer. Neither man spoke. They simply worked, side by side, like they had years before. I watched through the kitchen window. Mom stood beside me. They've always apologized better with their hands. A week later, disaster struck. Dad collapsed at work. One of his coworkers called the ambulance. By the time we reached the hospital, he was already in surgery. The waiting room felt endless. Every clock tick sounded louder than the last. Lily held my hand so tightly my fingers hurt. Grandma silently prayed. Grandpa stared at the floor. Mom didn't cry. She couldn't. She looked completely empty. Hours passed. Then the surgeon finally walked toward us. His expression revealed nothing. In that single moment, every argument, every unanswered question, every unfinished conversation suddenly seemed meaningless. All any of us wanted was one more chance. One more ordinary dinner. One more birthday. One more Saturday in the backyard. One more opportunity to say the things we'd spent years leaving unsaid. The doctor stopped in front of us, took a slow breath, and began to speak. Part 4: Redemption and Rebuilding. The surgeon removed his mask slowly. No one breathed. No one moved. The entire waiting room seemed to shrink until all that existed was the space between his eyes and ours. The surgery was successful. For a moment, the words didn't register. Then Mom covered her face with both hands. A quiet sob escaped before she could stop it. Lily collapsed into Grandma's arms. Grandpa closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." I didn't cry. Not yet. Relief sometimes arrives too exhausted to become tears. The next 48 hours are critical, the surgeon continued. His heart is weaker than he admitted. Recovery will take months, and his life will have to change. Life will have to change. Those 6 words echoed in my mind long after the doctor had walked away. The intensive care unit was unlike any place I had ever seen. The room smelled sterile. Machines hummed with mechanical precision. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, painting pale lines across the blanket covering Dad's chest. He looked smaller than I had ever imagined possible. Without his work boots, without his tool belt, without sawdust on his sleeves. Just a man. Tired man. For years I had seen him as someone impossible to break. Now I understood something adults rarely admit. Parents are simply people who kept going long after they became afraid. The first time Dad opened his eyes, he looked confused. Then he saw Mom. She smiled through tears. "You're still here." She laughed softly. "Where else would I be?" His voice was rough. "I thought. Maybe." She gently squeezed his hand. "You don't get to decide that for us." For the first time in years, there were no secrets between them. Only honesty. Painful. Necessary. Honesty. He remained in the hospital for nearly 3 weeks. Every afternoon after school, Lily and I visited. Some days we talked. Other days we simply sat together. Silence had changed. It was no longer hiding something. It had become companionship. One evening Dad looked toward the window. "I missed your basketball championship." I shrugged. "We lost." "Still." He swallowed hard. "I should have been there." I looked down at my hands. "You should have." Another long pause. "I'm sorry." This time, I believed him, not because the words were different, because the man saying them was. Rehabilitation was difficult. The doctors prohibited heavy lifting. No construction sites, No 12-hour shifts. No climbing ladders. Dad hated every restriction. He had spent his entire life believing his value came from what he could build with his hands. Now he had to discover who he was without them. That frightened him more than the surgery ever had. Money became even tighter. Without Dad's income, every dollar mattered. Mom increased her hours at the library. Grandpa quietly sold his old fishing boat. Grandma began baking pies for the town bakery. No one announced these sacrifices. They simply happened. Like breathing. Like love. One Saturday morning, I woke before sunrise. The backyard was unusually quiet. Then I heard the familiar sound of sandpaper. I looked outside. Dad was sitting beneath the oak tree. Not climbing. Just sanding one small wooden board resting across his knees. Slowly. Patiently. He looked up as I stepped onto the porch. Doctor said I can't build. He smiled faintly. He didn't say I couldn't teach. He handed me the sandpaper. Your turn. For the next 3 hours we worked side by side. Not on a house. Not on a business. On the treehouse. One small piece at a time. He taught me everything. How to read the grain of wood. How to measure twice. How to cut once. How to fix mistakes instead of hiding them. One afternoon I accidentally split an entire board. I ruined it. Dad picked it up. Ran his fingers along the crack. No. He walked to his workbench. Applied glue. Added 2 braces. Waited. An hour later, the board was stronger than before. He looked at me. Broken doesn't always mean weaker. I never forgot that lesson. Not because it was about wood. Because it wasn't. As spring returned, so did color. The garden bloomed again. Grandma's roses opened. Lily started laughing more often. Mom began humming while making breakfast. The same melodies I remembered from childhood. The house hadn't become perfect. But it had become honest. And somehow, that felt better. One evening, Dad carried a small box into the kitchen. The same cardboard box from the attic. He placed it on the table. I've been thinking. He looked at Mom. Then at Lily. Then at me. No more hidden letters. He opened the box. Inside were dozens of envelopes. Some stained by age. Some never sealed. He handed one to Mom. I should have given you these years ago. She smiled softly. I know. Then she handed one to me. What? I think they're yours now. I hesitated before opening it. It had been written on my 15th birthday. Years earlier. Ethan, if you're reading this someday, I hope I was brave enough to give it to you myself. If I wasn't, then I'm sorry. I've spent so much time trying to protect you from fear that I forgot something important. Children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones. If you ever become a father, promise me one thing. Don't hide your storms. Teach your children how to stand in the rain beside you. By the time I reached the final sentence, I could barely see the page. Not because the ink had faded, because tears had blurred every word. That summer, nearly 8 years after it had begun. The treehouse was finally finished. The whole family gathered beneath the old oak. Grandpa climbed the ladder first, insisting someone had to inspect the workmanship. Grandma followed more carefully. Lily decorated the railing with flower pots. Mom hung tiny lanterns along the porch. Dad stood quietly in the yard, looking up, not saying anything. I walked beside him. We finished it. He nodded. No. He smiled. We finished us. That evening we all ate dinner inside the treehouse. The table was too small. The chairs didn't match. The roof creaked whenever the wind blew. Grandpa claimed it was the finest dining room in the county. Lily insisted squirrels had better table manners than Grandpa. Everyone laughed. Real laughter. The kind that reaches your eyes. The kind our family hadn't heard in years. As the sun disappeared beyond the fields, warm light filled the little wooden room. For the first time in a very long time, it finally felt like home. But life still had one final lesson waiting for all of us. One that none of us could have imagined. And years later, it would bring us back to this treehouse one last time. Part 5, A New Beginning. 10 years passed more quickly than any of us expected. People always tell you that time heals. What they forget to mention is that time doesn't heal by itself. People do. One conversation, one apology, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. The blue house at the end of Willow Creek Road looked different now. Dad had finally repainted it himself. The porch no longer leaned to the left. The mailbox had been replaced, though Mom secretly admitted she missed the old squeak. The oak tree behind the house had grown so wide that 3 adults could barely wrap their arms around its trunk. And the treehouse. The treehouse had become part of the family. Birthdays were celebrated there. Christmas hot chocolate was served there whenever the weather allowed. Lily held her graduation party there. Even Grandpa claimed the coffee somehow tasted better 20 feet above the ground. No one argued with him. Dad never returned to construction work full-time. His heart simply wouldn't allow it. Instead, he opened a small woodworking workshop behind the house. He built dining tables, rocking chairs, bookshelves, toy boxes for young families. Every piece carried a tiny signature burned into the wood. Not his name, just 2 simple words. Built together. Customers often asked what it meant. Dad always smiled. It reminds me that nothing important is ever built alone. Mom remained at the library. She loved every minute of it. Children gathered around her every Saturday morning for story hour. She knew every regular by name. She remembered birthdays without writing them down. If someone walked into the library looking lonely, they almost always left carrying both a book and a smile. People thought she worked with stories. I always believed she quietly repaired them. Lily became exactly the person everyone expected. And exactly the person no one could have predicted. She studied pediatric nursing. She said children deserved someone who could make them laugh even inside hospitals. She was very good at it. Whenever she visited home, the house instantly became louder. She still made terrible jokes. She still laughed before finishing the punchline. Some things should never change. As for me, I became an architect. Maybe that surprised no one. After all, I'd spent my childhood dreaming about impossible houses. But somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't really designing buildings. I was designing places where people could belong. Every home I created had one rule. The kitchen always came first, because that was where our family had laughed, argued, cried, forgiven. Life had taught me that walls hold up roofs, but conversations hold up families. Grandpa Henry lived long enough to celebrate his 85th birthday. His steps became slower. His stories somehow became even bigger. According to him, the bear he'd once strategically escaped had grown from 6 feet tall to nearly 12. Lily rolled her eyes every time. Grandpa, by the time you're 90, that bear is going to breathe fire. He winked. Only on weekends. Even Dad laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Grandma Eleanor continued baking apple pies. No matter how many times we insisted one pie was enough, she always arrived with 2. One evening I finally asked her why. She looked genuinely confused. What if someone wants seconds? But they never finish the first one. She smiled knowingly. Exactly. Only years later did I understand. The second pie had never been about dessert. It was her way of saying, there will always be enough here for one more person. That was Grandma's definition of family. No announcement, no speech, just another pie. Then one autumn morning, Grandpa didn't wake up. He passed peacefully in his sleep. No pain, no fear, just quiet. The entire town attended the funeral. People I'd never met told stories about fences he'd repaired without charging. Neighbors he had helped after storms. Children whose bicycles he had secretly fixed overnight. I realized something standing there beside his casket. The richest people aren't remembered for what they owned. They're remembered for what they quietly repaired. Dad squeezed my shoulder. He would have hated everyone making such a fuss. I smiled through tears. He definitely would have corrected half the stories. Dad nodded, and made the other half bigger. A few months later, while cleaning Grandpa's garage, we found an old wooden box. Inside were dozens of photographs, fishing lures, rusty tools, and one envelope. Across the front, in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Open together." We waited until Sunday. The whole family gathered in the treehouse. Dad carefully unfolded the letter. Grandpa's handwriting wandered slightly across the page. Age had made it uneven, but every word felt unmistakably him. Families spend too much time trying to avoid breaking. Don't. Wood cracks. Hearts crack. Trust cracks. That isn't the end. The strongest tables I ever built weren't made from perfect boards. They were made from the ones I refused to throw away. Do the same with each other. Nobody spoke after Dad finished reading. The wind gently rustled the leaves outside. Somewhere in the distance, birds called to one another. Grandpa wasn't there, and somehow, he still was. Years continued moving forward. Eventually I got married. Then, one snowy December evening, my wife handed me a small box wrapped in red paper. Inside was a tiny pair of knitted baby socks. I looked at her, then at the socks, then back at her. We're having a baby. For a second, the room disappeared. I thought about Dad, about Mom, about every mistake, every apology, every Sunday dinner, every unfinished board in the treehouse. I suddenly understood why my father had been so afraid all those years. Love always arrives holding hands with fear. You cannot separate them. 9 months later, I stood in the hospital holding my daughter for the first time. She wrapped her impossibly small fingers around one of mine. I remembered something Dad had once written. Children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones. I whispered those words aloud, not as a promise to him, as a promise to her. On her 8th birthday, I took her into the backyard. The same oak tree stood taller than ever. The treehouse had aged beautifully. The wood carried marks from years of laughter, tiny scratches from toy cars, pencil lines measuring children's heights, old lantern hooks, family initials carved carefully into one railing. My daughter looked up. Can we build something together? I smiled. What did you have in mind? She pointed toward an empty branch beside the old treehouse. A little bridge. I laughed. A bridge to where? She shrugged. We'll figure it out. For a moment, I saw myself standing there decades earlier, asking my own father when the treehouse would finally be finished. Life has a funny way of repeating itself. Not as history, as opportunity. Dad, now older, walked slowly across the yard carrying 2 wooden planks. His hair had turned completely gray. His hands still carried tiny scars from years of work. He handed me a hammer, then another one to my daughter. You two start. She looked at him. Aren't you helping? He smiled. Oh, I am. He settled into a nearby chair beneath the shade of the oak. Sometimes helping means letting someone else build. The afternoon drifted by with the easy rhythm of family life. Mom brought out lemonade. Lily arrived with her husband and 2 energetic boys, who immediately declared the treehouse a pirate ship. Grandma Eleanor appeared carrying 2 apple pies, despite everyone's protests that one would have been enough. Dad watched all of us with quiet contentment. No rushing, no deadlines, no hidden fears, just the people he had spent his life trying to protect, finally laughing together in the open. As the sun slipped lower, golden light filtered through the branches, bathing the old treehouse in a warm glow. The unfinished place that had once symbolized fear had become the strongest symbol of hope our family possessed. I looked at my daughter as she proudly hammered a crooked nail into the new bridge. It isn't straight, she said, frowning. I smiled. It doesn't have to be. She looked confused. Why? Because the people crossing it won't remember the nail. They'll remember who built it with them. She grinned and reached for another board. Across the yard, Dad caught my eye. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. For the first time, I understood everything he had spent a lifetime trying to teach me. That homes are never held together by perfect walls. Families are never held together by perfect people. They are held together by ordinary people who choose, again and again, to stay, to forgive, to tell the truth, and to keep building, even after life has left its deepest cracks. Years from now, my daughter probably won't remember every birthday present or every family dinner. She may forget the color of the old blue house or the sound of Grandma's laughter echoing through the trees. But I hope she remembers this. A grandfather with scarred hands who believed love looked like something you built. A grandmother who always baked one extra pie because there was always room for one more. A mother who carried hope through the darkest seasons without asking for recognition. An aunt who proved that laughter could exist even inside hospital walls. And a family that discovered perfection was never the goal. Showing up for one another was. As evening settled over Willow Creek Road, the lights inside the treehouse flickered on one by one. From a distance, they looked like stars resting gently among the branches. Home had never been the blue house. It had never been the tree. It had never even been the treehouse. Home was every hand that reached back when someone thought they were falling. And perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave behind is not a perfect life, but the courage to keep building love. One honest day, one difficult conversation, and one unfinished promise fulfilled at a time.